In the middle of one of the densest jungles on Earth, someone built a city. Not a small settlement. Not a village of mud huts and dirt paths. A city with pyramids that rose above the jungle canopy, visible for miles in every direction, their stone tops catching the first light of dawn, while the forest below was still dark, with palaces and temples, and astronomical observatories, and ball courts and markets and aqueducts, and a writing system of extraordinary complexity, and a calendar more accurate than the one Europe was using. At the same time, the Maya, they built their civilization in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth, the tropical lowlands of what is now Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador, where the heat is brutal, where the rain comes in torrents for months, where the jungle fights back against every human attempt to clear it, growing over abandoned buildings within decades, swallowing cities whole within centuries. The jungle swallowed the Maya and kept their secrets for 1,000 years, until the explorers came and found, rising above the trees, the tops of pyramids that no one in the outside world had known were there. The Maya world was not one empire, not a single kingdom with a single king. It was a constellation of city-states, each one independent, each one with its own ruler, its own patron gods, its own artistic traditions. Tikal, Palenque, Copan, Chichen Itza, Uxmal, Calakmul, cities that traded with each other, that warred with each other, that formed alliances and broke them in the endlessly complicated political dance of neighboring powers that has characterized human civilization everywhere it has appeared. But for all their differences, the Maya cities shared something: a language family, a writing system, a calendar, a cosmology, a way of understanding the universe and humanity's place in it that was entirely their own, that had developed in the isolation of the jungle and the mountains of Mesoamerica over 3,000 years, without contact with the civilizations of the Old World, without Egypt or Greece or Rome to learn from or argue with, entirely independently, which makes what they achieved more extraordinary, not less. Human beings, given enough time and enough necessity, will build cities, will look at the stars, will ask why. Always, everywhere, without exception. The stars. The Maya were obsessed with the stars, not in the casual way that most ancient cultures watched the sky, but with a precision, a systematic rigor, a mathematical sophistication that modern astronomers have spent decades trying to fully understand. Their calendar was not one calendar. It was three, interlocking, running simultaneously, creating a system of extraordinary complexity for tracking time. The Tzolk'in, the sacred calendar, 260 days, used for religious ceremonies, for divination, for determining the ritual significance of any given day. The Hab, the solar calendar, 365 days, 18 months of 20 days each, plus 5 unlucky days at the end of the year. Days so dangerous, so full of bad omens, that the Maya tried not to do anything important during them, and the long count, a vast calendar that measured time in cycles of millions of years, that tracked where humanity stood in the great sweep of cosmic time. The famous date, December 21st, 2012, when the modern world briefly panicked about the end of the world, was simply the end of one great Maya cycle, the beginning of another. The Maya did not predict the end of the world. They predicted a new beginning. The world, they believed, had ended and begun again multiple times before. This was just another turning, another dawn. The cities were extraordinary. Palenque, in the foothills of the Chiapas highlands, is perhaps the most beautiful Maya site ever found. Its palace, a sprawling complex of courtyards and galleries, with a 4-story tower that may have served as an astronomical observatory, is decorated with carved stone reliefs of such refinement, such delicacy, that visitors who see it for the first time often stand in silence, not the silence of being unimpressed, the silence of being overwhelmed. The ruler most associated with Palenque's golden age was Tenochtitlan Pakal the Great. He ruled for 68 years, from 615 to 683 AD, one of the longest reigns in recorded history. Under Pakal, Palenque built the Temple of the Inscriptions, the pyramid that contains his tomb, discovered in 1952 by the archaeologist Alberto Rusluwilier, who noticed something unusual about the floor of the temple at the top. Stone plugs fitted into holes in the floor. He had them removed and found a staircase leading down into the heart of the pyramid. At the bottom, a burial chamber, and inside, a sarcophagus lid, carved with an image so complex, so detailed, so filled with Maya cosmological symbolism, that scholars spent decades arguing about what it meant: a king descending into the underworld, or ascending to the stars, depending on how you read it. Perhaps both. The ball game. Every Maya city had a court. The ulama, a game played with a heavy rubber ball, the first rubber ball in human history. The Americas had rubber. The Old World did not. Not until European contact with the Americas. In the 16th century, the Maya had been playing with rubber balls for over 3,000 years. The court was eye-shaped. 2 parallel walls, with a stone ring mounted high on each, through which the heavy rubber ball had to pass. The players could not use their hands. They used their hips, their elbows, their knees, driving the ball with the hardest parts of their bodies. A sport that required extraordinary athleticism and left its players bruised and bleeding from the constant impact. The stakes were high. Exactly how high? Historians still debate. The old stories say the losers were sacrificed. Some scholars say it was the winners, the honor of going to the gods still at the height of victory. Some say it depended on the occasion, the regular game versus the ritual game. What is certain? The ball game was more than sport. It was a ritual, reenactment of the cosmic struggle between the forces of life and death, light and darkness, that the Maya believed played out in the heavens above them, every day, every night, forever. The Maya wrote. This seems simple. It is not. Of all the civilizations that developed in the Americas, only the Maya developed a complete writing system, not pictographs, not simple symbols, a full writing system, capable of expressing any thought, any concept, any historical event, with the same flexibility and precision as Egyptian hieroglyphs or Chinese characters. The Maya script, a combination of logographs and syllabic signs, was carved into stone, painted on walls, written in books, called codices, made from bark paper, folded accordion style, covered in lime plaster, and painted with extraordinary care. Hundreds of these books existed. The Spanish priests, who arrived in the 16th century, burned almost all of them. Diego de Landa, the Franciscan bishop of Yucatan, burned 27 codices in a single day. In July of 1562, he later wrote about it, with something approaching regret, saying the Maya were very sorry, and it caused them great grief. Of course it did. He had burned their library. 3 codices survive. 3. From what was once a vast literature. 3 windows into a world of knowledge that existed for 2,000 years and was destroyed in a single afternoon. What was in those books? We will never know. Maize, corn, the foundation of everything the Maya built. Without maize, there is no Maya civilization, no pyramids, no calendars, no writing, no ball courts, no astronomical observations, just survival. At the edge of what the jungle would permit. With maize, everything was possible. The Maya did not just grow maize, they worshipped it. The maize god, Hunhinapu, was one of the most important deities in the Maya pantheon. His story of death and resurrection, of descending into the underworld and rising again, mirrored the annual cycle of the maize plant itself, planted in the ground, seemingly dead, rising again, feeding everyone. The Maya believed, quite literally, that human beings were made from maize. The gods had tried to create humanity. From mud failed, from wood failed, from maize succeeded. So when the Maya planted corn, they were not just farming, they were participating in the act of creation, repeating what the gods had done, sustaining the world through their labor, as the gods had sustained it through theirs. The field was sacred. The harvest was a miracle. Every year, without exception. Chichen Itza, the most famous Maya city, the one that survived longest, the one that drew the most visitors, both in the ancient world and in the modern one. Its Great Pyramid, El Castillo, the Temple of Kukulkan, is a calendar in stone. Each of its 4 sides has 91 steps. 4 times 91, plus the top platform, equals 365. The days of the year, counted in stone, by anyone who cared to count them. But the pyramid's most extraordinary feature is not mathematical, it is visual. On the spring and autumn equinox, twice a year, at precisely the right time of afternoon, the shadows of the pyramid's step corners fall on the northern staircase in a pattern that creates the image of a serpent descending from the top of the pyramid to the earth below. 7 triangles of light and shadow, forming the body of a snake that appears to move as the sun moves for approximately 34 minutes. The feathered serpent god Kukulkan returns to earth. The Maya engineers who designed this calculated the angles with no modern instruments, no computers, no lasers, no architectural software, just mathematics and observation, and 1,000 years of watching how light falls on stone twice a year. It still works exactly as they designed it. 1,500 years later, the Maya understood time differently than we do. For the Maya, time was not a line, it was a cycle, or rather, many cycles, nested inside each other, each one influencing the ones above and below. The day you were born determined your fate, or at least your destiny. The particular challenges and opportunities that the cosmos had arranged for you. The daykeeper, the Aztec, read the calendar and told you what your day sign meant, what kind of person you were likely to be, what work you were suited for, what gods you should honor, what days were lucky for you, and which ones to avoid for important decisions. This was not superstition, or rather, it was no more superstitious than the modern belief that the circumstances of your birth, your family, your culture, your historical moment shape who you become. The Maya had simply encoded that belief in a mathematical system of extraordinary precision. The calendar did not trap them in fate. It gave them a map, a way of understanding where they stood in the great turning of the cosmic wheel, and how to navigate what was coming. We navigate differently, with different tools. But the question, where am I? What is coming? How do I prepare? Is exactly the same. It always is. The jade. For the Maya, jade was more valuable than gold, more sacred, more beautiful, more charged with divine significance. The color of jade, that deep, complex green, was the color of the maize plant, of new growth, of life itself. Jade was life compressed into stone. Maya rulers wore jade, were buried in jade, had jade placed in their mouths at death to sustain them in the underworld. Pakal's burial mask, found in his tomb in the Temple of the inscriptions at Palenque, is made of jade mosaic, 240 pieces, fitted together with extraordinary precision, creating the face of a king, still recognizable, still beautiful. 1,300 years after it was made, the Maya worked jade with stone tools. They had no metal tools for most of their history, and yet produced objects of such refinement, such precision, that modern craftspeople who attempt to replicate them using modern diamond-tipped tools find it extraordinarily difficult. The skill was in the hands, in the years of practice, in the knowledge passed from master to apprentice, for generation after generation, of people who understood that making something beautiful was not separate from making something sacred, that they were the same act, performed with the same care, for the same reason, Because the gods, who had made humanity from maize, deserved nothing less than the most beautiful things human hands could make. The jungle is patient, more patient than any human civilization, more patient than stone. The Maya cities that were abandoned, for reasons we will come to, were swallowed within a generation. The plazas filled with vegetation within a century. The pyramids had trees growing from their sides within 5 centuries. The cities had disappeared, not destroyed, covered, preserved in a way by the very jungle that had hidden them. The stones stayed dry under its blanket of roots. The carvings survived because the jungle had sealed them. When John Lloyd Stevens, an American diplomat and explorer, arrived at Copan in 1839, he found a pyramid so covered in trees that he had to chop through the roots to find the carvings beneath. He bought the entire site for $50, not because he was taking advantage, but because no one knew what was there. No one knew that beneath the jungle lay one of the greatest civilizations the Americas had ever produced. That the trees were growing from pyramids, that the roots were wrapped around the faces of kings. Tonight, the jungle is quiet. The pyramids stand in the dark, some still buried, still waiting to be found, still holding their secrets, patient as the jungle, patient as stone, waiting. The Maya did not separate the sacred from the ordinary. For them, every aspect of life was religious. The planting of corn, the movement of stars, the birth of a child, the death of a king, all of it connected to the divine, all of it part of a vast, intricate, endlessly turning cosmic drama in which human beings played a necessary role, not a passive role, an active one. The gods had created humanity for a purpose, not for companionship, not out of loneliness, but because the gods needed something that only human beings could provide: sustenance. The gods were not immortal in the way we might imagine, existing without need, without hunger, beyond the requirements of ordinary existence. The Maya gods needed to be fed, and the food they required was blood, human blood, the most precious substance in the Maya world, not because the Maya were uniquely cruel, but because they understood the universe as a system of exchange. The gods had given everything: the sun, the rain, the maize, the world itself. In return, humanity owed a debt that could only be paid in the most valuable currency available: life itself. Itzamna, the Lord of the heavens, the Creator God, the first shaman, old in the Maya depictions, toothless, with a hooked nose, but alive with intelligence and cosmic power. He had given humanity writing in the calendar, medicine and maize, the arts of civilization. His wife was Nine Chel, goddess of the moon, of weaving, of medicine, of childbirth. Together they represented the complementary forces that sustained the world: male and female, sun and moon, creation and nurturing. Below Itzamna, a vast pantheon, the Bakabs, for brothers who stood at the corners of the world, holding up the sky. Chak, the rain god, perhaps the most important deity for ordinary farmers, the one whose favor determined whether the rains came, whether the crops grew, whether the family ate. His image appears on temples everywhere. His hooked nose, his curling fangs, a face so commonly carved that archaeologists use its presence or absence to date Maya buildings. Kukulkan, the feathered serpent, the same god the Aztecs would call Quetzalcoatl, a deity of wind and rain, of knowledge and civilization, whose return Chichen Itza celebrated twice a year, in stone and shadow. The hero twins, the most beloved story in the Maya world, recorded in the Popol Vuh, the Maya creation narrative, written down by the Quiché Maya of Guatemala after the Spanish conquest, preserving a story that had been told for centuries before. Hunahpu and Xbalanque, twin brothers, sons of the maize god, who had been killed by the lords of Xibalba, the underworld. The twins were called to Xibalba, summoned to play the ball game against the lords of death, not to play, but to be sacrificed. The lords of Xibalba had killed their father, were confident they could kill his sons. The twins were cleverer. They passed the tests that killed ordinary men. They navigated the dark houses, the cold houses, the fire houses, the razor houses, each one designed to destroy them. They survived. They played the ball game, won, and in winning, outwitted death itself. The lords of Xibalba were defeated. The maize god was resurrected, and the hero twins rose into the sky, becoming the sun and moon, or Jupiter and Venus. The sources disagree. The story was not just entertainment. It was the Maya explanation of why the sun rises every morning, why death is not the end, why the maize grows again after being buried in the ground, why the cosmos continues against all odds, against death itself. Xibalba, the Maya underworld, not hell, not a place of eternal punishment for sin, but a place of danger and darkness that every soul had to navigate after death, ruled by 12 lords, 1 death and 7 death, the most powerful, with names that described what they did: Pus Master, Jaundice Master, Bone Scepter, Skull Scepter, each one a personification of disease and death. The things the Maya feared most, not evil in a moral sense, simply the forces that ended life, that the hero twins had defeated, that every Maya hoped, through the right rituals, the right offerings, the right behavior in life, could be navigated safely. The path through Xibalba was long and dangerous, crossing rivers of blood, navigating dark houses, where invisible dangers waited. The dead needed provisions, food, water, tools, which is why the Maya buried their dead with everything they might need for the journey, and they needed help from the living. The rituals performed by the living, the offerings made, the prayers said, the blood spilled, sustained the dead as they traveled, made the journey slightly less impossible, which is why the rituals mattered, why they could not be skipped, why the priests who performed them were among the most important people in Maya society. The dead depended on the living, and the living knew it. The priests. In Maya society, the priests were the keepers of everything that mattered. The calendar, which determined when to plant, when to harvest, when to go to war, when to hold ceremonies. The writing, which recorded history, preserved astronomical observations, maintained the genealogies of ruling families. The astronomical knowledge, which predicted eclipses, tracked the movements of Venus and Jupiter, calculated the long cycles of cosmic time, and the rituals, the endless, precise, cosmologically necessary rituals that kept the universe functioning. A priest who made an error, who performed a ritual incorrectly, who miscalculated a date, who mispronounced a sacred text, was not merely incompetent, he had potentially damaged the relationship between humanity and the gods, had potentially weakened the cosmic machinery that held the world together. The stakes were not professional embarrassment. The stakes were existential. This gave the priests enormous power and enormous responsibility. They were, in a real sense, the people on whom everything depended. If the rains didn't come, had the priests failed? If the crops failed, had the rituals been wrong? If an eclipse darkened the sun, what had been neglected? The priests had to answer these questions with their knowledge, with their blood, with their lives, if necessary. Bloodletting, the most common form of Maya sacrifice, was not the sacrifice of other people. It was self-sacrifice, the offering of one's own blood, by rulers, by nobles, by priests, as sustenance for the gods. The methods were painful. Thorns of the maguey plant, pushed through the tongue, through the earlobes, through other sensitive places. Stingray spines, carried from the coast, hundreds of miles inland, because the sea was sacred, and the stingray's spine, the most appropriate instrument for drawing sacred blood. The blood was collected on bark paper and burned, the smoke rising toward the gods, carrying the offering upward into the divine realm. The pain was part of the gift, an offering that cost nothing, that required no sacrifice, no endurance, was worth nothing. The gods had given everything. The appropriate response was to give everything in return, or as close to everything as the human body could manage, while still leaving the donor alive to give again tomorrow. The kings bled most, because they had the most to give, because their blood, royal blood, blood with divine ancestry, was more powerful than ordinary blood. The images of Maya queens performing bloodletting, pulling thorn-studded rope through their tongues, are among the most striking in Maya art. Women performing the most sacred ritual, because the gods did not discriminate. They needed blood. Whoever gave it was serving the cosmos. Human sacrifice. It happened. The Maya practiced it, but not with the industrial scale that popular imagination, shaped by Hollywood and sensationalist history, tends to picture. Human sacrifice in the classic Maya period was relatively rare, reserved for the most significant occasions: the dedication of a major temple, the coronation of a new king, the end of a great calendar cycle, the conclusion of a war. The victims were often war captives, noble warriors captured in battle specifically for this purpose. This is important. The Maya wars of the classic period were not wars of annihilation, not attempts to destroy the enemy completely. They were wars of capture. The goal was to take noble prisoners, men whose blood was powerful enough to be worth offering. A dead enemy on the battlefield was worth less than a captured one who could be brought home in chains, displayed publicly, humiliated ritually, and eventually offered to the gods. The captured warrior was not simply a victim, he was a participant, however unwilling, in a cosmic transaction that the Maya believed was necessary for the world to continue. His death fed the gods, who fed the world, who fed everyone. The logic was merciless and internally consistent, as the logic of the cosmos tends to be. The vision serpent. In Maya ritual, when a priest or ruler had offered enough blood, when the sacred smoke rose thick enough, a vision came. The ancients described it as a great serpent rising from the smoke, its mouth opening, and from the mouth an ancestor emerging, or a god speaking, giving counsel, offering prophecy, confirming legitimacy. Whether these visions were genuine spiritual experiences or the result of blood loss and pain, producing altered states, is a question that depends on what you believe about the nature of reality. The Maya did not make this distinction. The vision was real. The ancestor was present. The god had spoken. The ritual had worked. And the ruler who had bled and suffered and seen the vision returned to the world with authority renewed, with divine sanction, with the confidence of someone who had stood at the edge of the sacred and come back. The images of these ceremonies, carved on Maya stele, stone monuments erected to record significant events, show the vision serpent clearly, rising from bowls of blood, its mouth open, a figure emerging, a conversation between the world of the living and the world of the dead, made possible by pain, by offering, by the willingness to bleed for something larger than yourself. The temples were not just places of worship. They were machines, precisely engineered machines, for amplifying the connection between the human world and the divine one. The pyramid shape was not arbitrary. It was a mountain, an artificial mountain, built where mountains didn't exist, to bring the priests closer to the sky, closer to the gods who lived there. The temple at the top, the small room at the summit, was the most sacred space. In the city, only the highest priest entered. Inside, the rituals that kept the cosmos functioning. Below, the city watched. Tens of thousands of people gathered in the great plazas, looking up at the summit of the pyramid, where smoke rose, where drums sounded, where the priests performed the ceremonies that stood between them and cosmic chaos. The pyramid was a stage. The ritual was theater, but theater in the deepest sense, not fiction, reality, the performance of actions that had real consequences in the real world. If the priest succeeded, the rains came, the maize grew, the sun rose tomorrow. If he failed, the consequences were not merely symbolic, they were actual. This is the weight that every Maya priest carried. Every time he climbed those steps, every time he reached the top, every time he looked up at the sky and began The death of a king, in Maya society, was the most significant religious event that could occur. The king was not just a political leader, he was the axis around which the cosmic order turned. He was the living representative of the maize god, who died and was reborn. He was the conduit between humanity and the divine. When he died, the world held its breath. The rituals of royal burial were the most elaborate, the most expensive, the most cosmologically significant ceremonies in my life. The body was prepared, jade placed in the mouth, jade mosaic mask fitted over the face, dressed in all the regalia of office, and placed in a tomb that was itself a representation of the underworld. The pyramid built above was not just a monument, it was a portal, a connection between the world of the living and the world of the dead, through which the dead king could still communicate, could still be present, could still intercede with the gods on behalf of his people. The king was dead, but not gone, never entirely gone. Still present in the pyramid, still available, through the right rituals, the right offerings, to speak, through the vision serpent, through the smoke, through the blood, of those who loved him, and needed him still. The gods are hungry tonight, as they are always hungry, as they have been, since the beginning, since the first fire was lit on the first altar on the first pyramid, by the first priest, who understood that the universe does not sustain itself, that someone has to pay, that the dead is real, however we choose to understand it, however we choose to pay it. The Maya paid in blood. We pay in other ways, in labor, in attention, in the daily work of maintaining the relationships and the institutions and the shared agreements that hold civilization together. The form changes, the fundamental reality that existence requires maintenance, that beauty requires effort, that the things worth having require sacrifice. Does not. The smoke rises tonight from no altar. The drums are silent. The priests are gone. But the pyramids remain. Stone altars, pointing at the stars, still aimed at the same sky. The Maya priests aimed at, still asking the same questions, still waiting for the answer that the gods, if they exist, have never quite given clearly. Only in rain, only in maize, only in the sun that rises tomorrow, as it always has, fed by something. Around 800 AD, something went wrong. Not in one city, not in one region, across the entire southern Maya lowlands, the heartland of classic Maya civilization. Cities that had stood for centuries began to empty. Slowly at first. The construction stopped. New monuments ceased to be erected. The long count dates, carved on stele, those precise records of historical events, simply ended. No final inscription, no record of disaster, no explanation, just silence. The last dated monument in the southern lowlands was erected at Tanina in 909 AD. After that, nothing. The cities did not burn. The populations were not massacred. The pyramids were not torn down. They were simply left. People walked away from cities that had taken centuries to build, from the pyramids their ancestors had raised, from the temples their priests had tended, from the markets and ball courts and palaces and plazas, and did not come back. The jungle moved in, and within a century, the greatest civilization the Americas had produced, in the tropical lowlands, had disappeared, leaving only stone and questions that archaeologists have been asking for over a century and have not entirely answered. What happened to the Maya? Around 800 AD, something went wrong. Not in one city, not in one region, across the entire southern Maya lowlands, the heartland of classic Maya civilization. Cities that had stood for centuries began to empty. Slowly at first, the construction stopped. New monuments ceased to be erected. The long count dates, carved on stele, those precise records of historical events, simply ended. No final inscription, no record of disaster, no explanation, just silence. The last dated monument, in the southern lowlands, was erected at Tanina in 909 AD. After that, nothing. The cities did not burn. The populations were not massacred. The pyramids were not torn down. They were simply left. People walked away from cities that had taken centuries to build. From the pyramids their ancestors had raised, from the temples their priests had tended, from the markets and ball courts and palaces and plazas, and did not come back. The jungle moved in, and within a century, the greatest civilization the Americas had produced, in the tropical lowlands, had disappeared, leaving only stone and questions that archaeologists have been asking for over a century and have not entirely answered. What happened to the Maya? The first Europeans who found the abandoned cities assumed catastrophe, war, plague, earthquake, some sudden, total disaster that had wiped out an entire civilization overnight. The reality was more complicated, more human, more recognizable. The Maya collapse. Historians now call it the terminal classic collapse. Was not sudden. It took over a century. From roughly 800 to 900 AD, the cities declined. Not all at once. Not in a single wave. Some collapsed early. Some held on longer. Some, in the northern Yucatan, never collapsed at all. Chichen Itza was still flourishing in 900 AD. The collapse was not the end of the Maya. It was the end of a particular period, the classic period, and a particular pattern of urban life in the southern lowlands. The Maya continued in the north, in the highlands, in smaller communities throughout the region. The descendants of the classic Maya were still there when the Spanish arrived 600 years later, are still there today. Millions of people speaking Maya languages, maintaining Maya traditions, living descendants of the civilization that built Tikal and Palenque. The collapse was real, but it was not extinction. It was transformation. Painful, catastrophic transformation, but transformation nonetheless. The drought hypothesis, the most widely accepted explanation for the Maya collapse, is climate. Specifically, a series of severe droughts that struck the southern Maya lowlands between roughly 800 and 1000 AD. The evidence comes from multiple sources, sediment cores, from lake bottoms, which preserve a chemical record of rainfall levels going back thousands of years, stalagmites from caves, which grow at different rates, depending on how much water percolates through the rock. Both sources show the same pattern: significantly reduced rainfall during exactly the period when the classic Maya cities were being abandoned for a civilization almost entirely dependent on rainfall agriculture, with no rivers large enough to irrigate from, no alternative water source. In the flat limestone landscape of the Yucatan, a sustained drought was not merely inconvenient, it was existential. The reservoirs that the Maya had built, vast cisterns that captured rainwater during the wet season, could sustain a city through a single dry year, perhaps two. Not a decade of drought, not the sustained reduction in rainfall that the sediment cores show. When the reservoirs ran dry, the cities had nothing. The kings failed. This is perhaps the most human explanation of all. The Maya king, the Ajah, was responsible for everything. The rains came because the king performed the correct rituals. The crops grew because the king maintained right relations with the gods. The cosmos continued because the king stood at the center of the sacred machinery and kept it running. When the rains stopped coming, the king had failed. When the crops failed, the king had failed. And in Maya political culture, a king who failed at his fundamental duty lost the mandate of heaven, lost the loyalty of his nobles, lost the confidence of his people, and was replaced, or overthrown, or simply ignored, as people began doing what people do when the system fails them. They left. They went somewhere else, somewhere that seemed to offer better prospects, somewhere the rains still came, somewhere a different king seemed to be maintaining better relations with the cosmic order. The abandonment of the cities, seen from this angle, was not a mystery. It was a rational response to a system that had stopped working. People voted with their feet, as people always do when the promises of civilization cannot be kept. The warfare escalated as resources became scarcer. The wars between Maya cities became more frequent, more destructive, more desperate. The archaeology shows it. The fortifications that appear around Maya cities in the terminal classic period, walls and ditches that hadn't been needed in the cities confident earlier centuries, suggest a world becoming more dangerous, more zero-sum, where one city's survival came at another's expense. The noble prisoners, who had always been captured for ritual sacrifice, were now being taken in numbers that suggested something more than ritual, something more like the brutal calculus of survival. Inscriptions from the period record military victories with a frequency and a ferocity that the earlier classic period had not shown. Cities sacking other cities, not just defeating them, but destroying them, burning their monuments, defacing their stelae, erasing the names of their kings from the historical record. The careful, ritualized warfare of the earlier period, aimed at capture, at tribute, at display, was becoming something uglier. Something that looked less like politics and more like desperation. The world the Maya had built over 1,000 years was coming apart, and the people living through it could feel it, even if they couldn't understand why, even if the priests were still performing the correct rituals, even if the king was still climbing the pyramid steps. Something was broken, and no ritual could fix it. What did it feel like to live through the Maya collapse? This is a question the archaeology cannot fully answer, but it can hint. A family in a mid-sized Maya city around 850 AD. The grandfather remembers the city at its peak, the markets full, the festivals crowded, the pyramids gleaming with fresh plaster. The father has watched the decline, the construction that stopped, the festivals that became smaller each year, the market stalls that went empty, the families that left quietly without ceremony and didn't come back. The child has grown up in a city that feels like an exhalation, a breath being slowly let out. Not crisis, not catastrophe, just diminishment. The sense that things are contracting, that the world is getting smaller, that the future that was assumed may not arrive. And then one season, the rains fail again. The reservoir is lower than it has ever been. The king performs the rituals on the pyramid, and the rains still don't come. And the family looks at each other, and someone says, "My cousin went north, says there is water there, says the fields are good." And the decision is made, not with fanfare, not with drama, with the quiet practicality of people who understand that survival matters more than loyalty to a place, more than the stone that their ancestors built, more than the pyramid that still rises above the tree line, getting smaller behind them as they walk away. The northern cities survived, while the southern lowlands emptied. Chichen Itza flourished, Uxmal flourished, Mayapan flourished. The northern Yucatan, with its different geology, its cenotes, natural sinkholes that accessed underground water, was not dependent on rainfall in the same way. The cenotes provided water, even in dry years, and so the north survived, and more than survived. It drew the refugees from the collapsing south, skilled artisans, architects, priests, administrators, warriors, all of them bringing their knowledge and their traditions into the northern cities that were still functioning. Chichen Itza in the 9th and 10th centuries shows a mixture of classic Maya traditions and new influences from the Gulf Coast, from central Mexico, from the Toltec culture that was expanding. At the same time, the feathered serpent, Kukulkan, the same deity that the Toltecs called Quetzalcoatl, appears prominently at Chichen Itza, in forms that had not appeared in the classic period. The Maya world was not isolated. It never had been. Even in collapse, it was connected, absorbing, transforming, becoming something new from the ruins of what it had been. The lesson of the Maya collapse has been read differently by different people in different centuries. For the Spanish priests who first wrote about it, it was divine punishment. The gods of the Maya had failed them, as false gods always fail, and the true God had withdrawn his favor. For the 19th century, explorers who rediscovered the abandoned cities. It was mystery, romantic, inexplicable mystery, a civilization that vanished without trace, leaving only ruins and questions. For the 20th century, archaeologists who began to understand what had actually happened. It was a case study in the collapse of complex societies. Jared Diamond, in his book Collapse, used the Maya as one of his central examples of how civilizations destroy themselves through environmental mismanagement, political failure, and the inability to adapt to changing conditions. For the 21st century, the Maya collapse feels uncomfortably familiar. A civilization at its peak, deforesting its landscape, overextending its agriculture, warming its own climate, and then failing to respond effectively when the consequences arrived, because the political system was too focused on short-term competition, too invested in maintaining the structures of power to make the changes that survival required. The Maya are not a cautionary tale about the distant past. They are a mirror held up to the present by 10 centuries of stone. The cities were not entirely abandoned. This is important. Some people stayed in the centuries after the terminal classic collapse. Small communities persisted in and around the great abandoned cities, not maintaining the pyramids, not performing the elaborate state rituals, not erecting new stelae, or recording new dates in the long count, but living, growing maize in the old plazas, using the old buildings for shelter, burying their dead in the old tombs. The great city of Tikal, abandoned by its population of 60,000, was not entirely empty. Small groups continued to live there, perhaps hundreds of people, for centuries after the collapse, living in the shadow of the pyramids their ancestors had built, understanding perhaps only dimly what those structures had once meant, what the people who built them had believed, what had happened to bring those people, that world, to an end. The jungle grew around them. The howler monkeys colonized the temple tops, the roots of the ceiba trees, the sacred tree of Maya cosmology, the Axis Mundi, wrapped themselves around the carved stones, as if the forest was trying to read them, as if the world was trying to understand what had been lost and why. The collapsed cities are quiet tonight. Tikal, Palenque, Copan, Caracol, Quirigua, Yaxchilan. Their pyramids rise above the jungle, some excavated and restored, their plaster gleaming again, others still buried, still wrapped in roots, still holding whatever secrets they contain. The howler monkeys call across the canopy, the sound that terrified the first explorers who heard it, thinking it was something else entirely, something supernatural, something from the world. The pyramids pointed toward. The stars are out. The same stars the Maya astronomers tracked with such precision. Venus rising in the east, as it has risen every 8 years, in the same pattern, predictable as mathematics, beautiful as everything. That is both true and old. The Maya collapse was real. The consequences were real. The suffering of the people who lived through it was real. But the stars continued. The maize continued to grow where the soil was good, and the water came. The people continued, carrying what they could of what had been into the uncertain future. That is the only future any civilization ever has. The jungle breathes tonight, in and out, patient as it has always been. Older than the pyramids, older than the Maya, older than anything human hands have made, or will make. Still here, still waiting for whatever comes next. They began with nothing. No land, no city, no allies, no resources. A wandering people, called the Mexica, who arrived in the Valley of Mexico sometime in the 13th century, and found that every good piece of land was already taken, every fertile valley, every strategic hilltop, every productive lake shore, occupied, claimed, defended, by people who had been there longer, who looked at the Mexica with contempt, called them barbarians, hired them as mercenaries when fighting was needed, used them, discarded them. The Mexica accepted this. For a while, they were patient people, or rather, they were people who understood that patience is a form of strategy, that weakness, acknowledged, endured, is not permanent, that the moment always comes, if you are watching for it, when the balance shifts, when the opportunity appears, when the wanderers, who were despised, become the power that everyone fears. In less than 2 centuries, the Mexica went from landless wanderers to rulers of an empire that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific coast, from nothing to everything. In 200 years, the story of how they did it is one of the most extraordinary stories in human history. The Heron Signal. The Mexica had a prophecy. Their god, Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south, the god of war and the sun, had told them, through his priests, that they would know their destined home when they saw it, an eagle, sitting on a cactus, eating a snake, on an island, in a lake. They had been looking for this sign for generations, walking, wandering, serving, suffering, and then, around 1325 AD, in the shallow, marshy, western part of Lake Texcoco, they saw it, the eagle, the cactus, the snake, on a small island, barely habitable, surrounded by swamp, that no one else wanted, which was precisely why it was still available. The Mexica took it, named their new city Tenochtitlan, place of the prickly pear cactus, and began to build the image of the eagle on the cactus with the snake. Is still the national symbol of Mexico today, on the flag, on the coins, on the official seal. 700 years later, still there, still pointing back to the moment when a wandering people found their home in a swamp that no one else wanted. Building a city on a lake, the engineering challenge was extraordinary. The island was small, the water was shallow, but it was still water. The Mexica solved this the way they solved most problems. with ingenuity and labor. Chinampas, artificial islands, built by staking out rectangular sections of the shallow lake, filling them with mud and vegetation, planting them with crops, and then building on them. The Chinampas, sometimes called floating gardens, though they were anchored to the lake bottom, were extraordinarily productive. The rich lake mud, the constant water access, the mild climate, allowed multiple harvests per year, produced more food per acre than almost any other agricultural system in the ancient world. The Aztecs ate well, and as the city grew, as more Chinampas were built, as the island was extended further and further into the lake, Tenochtitlan became one of the largest cities on Earth. By the time the Spanish arrived, it had a population of perhaps 200,000, larger than any city in Europe at the time. London in 1519 had perhaps 50,000 people, Paris perhaps 200,000. But filthy, crowded, riddled with disease, Tenochtitlan, with its clean water supply, its waste management systems, its markets, its gardens, was, by many measures, the finest city on earth. The Triple Alliance, the Aztec Empire, which the Mexica built, was not built by conquest alone. It was built through a political masterstroke. In 1428, the Mexica allied with two neighboring cities, Texcoco and Tlacopan, to defeat their common enemy, the Tepanec Empire, that had dominated the Valley of Mexico. The victory was complete, and then the three allied cities divided the conquered territories, Tenochtitlan taking the largest share. The Triple Alliance, as historians call it, was the foundation of Aztec imperial power, not one city conquering alone, but three cities working together, each with its own ruler, its own traditions, its own contribution to the alliance, creating something more powerful than any of them could have been separately. The Aztec Empire that resulted was not administered in the way Rome administered, not with governors and garrisons and direct Roman rule. The Aztecs preferred a different model. Conquer a city, demand tribute, leave local rulers in place. As long as the tribute kept coming, it was efficient. It required fewer soldiers, fewer administrators, less infrastructure, and it worked until it created exactly the problem that would eventually destroy the empire. Resentful subjects who had been conquered but not integrated, who remembered what had been taken from them and were waiting for someone to help them take it back. Tenochtitlan at its peak. Imagine arriving by canoe, crossing the open lake, the city rising before you, on the horizon, connected to the shore by three great causeways, wide enough for 10 horsemen to ride abreast. Though the Aztecs had no horses, the causeways connected the island to the mainland, north, south, and west, with removable bridges at intervals that could be raised to flood protect the city or to stop an invading army. On the island, the great temple at the center, the Templo Mayor, a double pyramid dedicated to two gods, Huitzilopochtli, god of war, and Tlaloc, god of rain, life and war, water and blood, the two things the Aztec world could not live without. Around the temple, the sacred precinct, palaces of the rulers, ball courts, schools, storehouses filled with tribute from across the empire. Beyond the precinct, the city itself, markets, workshops, neighborhoods organized by trade and by clan, gardens and canals, the constant movement of canoes on the water, the great market at Tlatelolco, the sister city, on the same island, was visited by 60,000 people. On market days, the Spanish soldier, Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who walked through it in 1519, wrote that he had never seen anything like it, that the largest markets of Spain, of Constantinople, could not compare, that the variety of goods, the organization, the volume of trade, left him speechless. A soldier not easily left speechless. The flower wars, the Aztec Empire, needed something that regular conquest could not always provide: sacrificial victims. The gods required blood, as the Maya gods had required blood, but the Aztec gods, particularly Huitzilopochtli, seemed to require more of it, much more. The flower wars, Zakiayot, were ritualized battles, fought not to conquer territory, not to gain tribute, but specifically to capture warriors for sacrifice. Two armies would meet in an agreed location. They would fight genuinely, with real weapons, real wounds, real danger. But the goal was not to kill the enemy. The goal was to capture them alive. A dead warrior on the battlefield was worth nothing sacrificially. A living warrior, brought home in chains, was everything. The flower wars were fought regularly with the same neighboring states, particularly Tlaxcala. Over decades, the same enemies, the same battles, over and over, an arrangement that suited both sides. The Aztecs got their captives, the Tlaxcalans got battle-hardened warriors, and a state of permanent military readiness that would prove useful when the Spanish arrived and needed allies. The Tlatoani, the Aztec ruler, the word means he who speaks the voice of the divine. In the human world, he was not a god himself, as the pharaoh was considered a god. He was the representative, the intermediary, the most sacred human being in the empire, but human nonetheless. The greatest of the Aztec Tlatoani was Moctezuma I, not the Moctezuma who would meet Cortez, but his predecessor, who ruled from 1440 to 1469. Under Moctezuma I, the empire expanded dramatically. The tribute system was systematized. The social structure, already complex, became more rigid, more hierarchical, more explicitly tied to military achievement. A man's rank in Aztec society was determined largely by how many captives he had taken in battle. This created a warrior class of extraordinary motivation. Every battle, every flower war, was an opportunity for advancement, for honor, for the gifts, land, cacao, feathers, that a grateful ruler bestowed on successful warriors. The system worked brilliantly as a military incentive structure. It also meant that Aztec society was permanently organized for war, could not easily become something else, could not imagine itself without the flower wars, without the sacrifices, without the hierarchy. That military achievement justified when that system was challenged, when something arrived from outside it that the hierarchy could not process. The whole structure was vulnerable in ways no one inside it could see. The education system. The Aztecs educated everyone, not just the nobles, not just the priesthood, everyone. The Calmecac, the school attached to the temple, was for the children of nobles and priests. Here they learned the calendar, the writing system, the history of the empire, the astronomical observations, the ritual requirements, the hard curriculum, the one that produced priests and administrators and military commanders. But the Telpakali, the house of youth, was for everyone else, for the children of commoners, of farmers and craftsmen and merchants, boys and girls both, who learned the history and traditions of their people, the songs and dances required for religious festivals, military training for the boys, weaving and domestic arts for the girls, but also history, also tradition, also the understanding of their place in the cosmic order. Every child, of whatever class, was educated. This was not philanthropy. It was practicality, a civilization that maintained itself through elaborate ritual, through the precise performance of ceremonies that required thousands of participants to know exactly what they were doing, could not afford ignorance. Every person in Tenochtitlan had a role. Every role required knowledge. The education system ensured the knowledge existed, that the ceremonies could be performed, that the gods could be fed, that the sun could rise tomorrow. The merchants, the Paktika, a special class in Aztec society, neither noble nor commoner, but occupying a strange, powerful, carefully defined middle space. They traveled beyond the borders of the empire into distant, potentially hostile territories, trading luxury goods, feathers of the quetzal bird, jade, gold, cacao, obsidian, turquoise. They were also spies, gathering intelligence for the emperor, reporting on the military strength of distant peoples, the layout of cities, the allegiances of rulers, and they were sacred. The god of merchants was Yakutacutli, Lord who guides, and the merchants honored him with elaborate rituals before each journey, because each journey was dangerous. A merchant who died far from home, in a foreign land, was considered to have died in a form of battle, to have earned a warrior's afterlife. The Aztec world, which we tend to picture as a world of pyramids and sacrifice and warfare, was also a world of extraordinary commercial activity, of trade networks that stretched across Mesoamerica, of merchants who walked thousands of miles, carrying luxury goods on their backs, because the Aztecs had no wheeled vehicles, no horses, just human legs, and the road, and the god who guided. The women of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec world, was formerly patriarchal. Men held political power. Men led the armies. Men performed the most sacred rituals. But Aztec women, like women everywhere, were not passive. They ran the households. They controlled the markets. Women dominated the marketplace trade in ways that gave them real economic power. They were midwives and healers, professions of enormous social importance in a world where childbirth was the most dangerous thing most people did. A woman who died in childbirth, the Aztecs believed, died a warrior's death. She had fought the hardest battle. She joined the Cihuateteo, the divine women, who accompanied the sun across the afternoon sky. The parallel was explicit and intentional. The warrior captured the sun in the morning and carried it to noon. The woman who died in childbirth received the sun at noon and carried it to dusk. Both warriors, both sacred, both necessary. The Aztec world needed warriors in the traditional sense, men who captured sacrificial victims, who expanded the empire, but it also needed the women who produced the next generation, who kept the households running, who maintained the daily fabric of a civilization that could not function without 10,000 small acts of care performed every day by people whose names the history books mostly didn't bother to record. Tenochtitlan stands tonight in the imagination, because in reality, it stands only in fragments. The Spanish who conquered it tore it down, used its stones to build their own city, Mexico City. On top of it, the Templo Mayor, the great double pyramid at the center of the Aztec world, was discovered by accident. In 1978, electrical workers digging beneath downtown Mexico City found a massive stone disc, 8.5 tons of carved rock, the image of Coilzocatl, the moon goddess, dismembered by Huitzilopochtli at the beginning of the world. One stone that opened a decade of excavation that revealed the Templo Mayor, 7 times rebuilt, each new temple encasing the previous one, still there, under Mexico City, under the streets that millions of people walk every day, not knowing what is beneath them. The greatest city the Americas ever built, still there, in layers, patient as stone, waiting to be understood, as all great things wait, in the dark, for someone to bring a light. At the center of Tenochtitlan, at the center of the empire, at the center of the Aztec understanding of the universe, stood a pyramid. Not one pyramid, 2, side by side, rising from the same base, 2 staircases climbing to 2 temples at the top, each one dedicated to a different god. The Templo Mayor, the Great Temple. On the left, the Temple of Tlaloc, god of rain, god of water, god of the harvest, painted blue and white, the colors of water. On the right, the Temple of Huitzilopochtli, god of war, god of the sun, the god who had led the Mexica from their wandering homeland to their destined city, painted red and white, the colors of blood and bone. 2 gods, 2 temples, 1 pyramid. The duality was not accidental, it was cosmological. Life requires water, life requires sun, civilization requires the harvest and the warrior, the nourishing and the fighting, the rain that fills the fields, and the blood that feeds the sun. Both necessary, both sacred, both housed in The same building, at the heart of the greatest city in the Americas, Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the South. The name is strange. A hummingbird seems an unlikely war god, until you understand the symbolism. In Aztec belief, warriors who died in battle were reborn as hummingbirds. The tiny, fierce, impossibly fast birds that dart and hover and drink from flowers were the souls of dead warriors, still fighting, still moving, still alive, in a different form. Huitzilopochtli himself was a warrior reborn, born fully armed, fully grown, from his mother Coatlicue, to defend her against his sister and brothers, who were trying to kill her. He emerged from the womb, already fighting, already wearing the warrior's paint, already carrying his weapon, the Xiacotl, the fire serpent, and destroyed his enemies. In the moment of his birth, the story was reenacted. Every day, every sunrise, Huitzilopochtli fought his sister Coatlicue, the moon, and won. The sun rose. The darkness was defeated, but the victory was never permanent. Each night, the darkness returned. Each morning, the battle had to be fought again, and the sun needed strength for that battle. Human blood, the most powerful fuel in the Aztec universe. Tlaloc, the rain god, older than the Aztecs, older than the Toltecs, older than almost anything in Mesoamerica. His goggle eyes and fanged mouth appear in art going back to Teotihuacan, the great city that preceded all of them. Perhaps 2,000 years ago, Tlaloc was not a gentle god. He could withhold the rain, could send floods, could call lightning, could take children. The Aztecs believed that children who drowned or who died of water-related illnesses went to Tlaloc's paradise, a green, watery realm called Tlalocan, where food was abundant and life was easy, which made child sacrifice a practice the Aztecs did perform, though less frequently than popular imagination suggests. Not cruelty. In the Aztec understanding, ascending, a gift of the most innocent and powerful, to the god who held the rain, who could give it or withhold it as he chose. We do not have to accept this logic. We do not have to approve of it. But we have to understand it. To understand the people who believed it, who were not monsters, who were human beings, trying to survive in a world that felt profoundly uncertain, and doing what their cosmology told them was necessary, as people always do. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. We have met him before, as Kukulkan of the Maya. For the Aztecs, he was one of the most important deities in the pantheon, god of wind, of learning, of the priesthood, of the planet Venus, and, most significantly for what was coming, a god who had once walked among humans. In the ancient stories, Quetzalcoatl had ruled as a priest-king in the city of Tula. The Toltec capital, had taught the arts of civilization, had forbidden human sacrifice, had eventually been tricked by his enemy, the dark god Tezcatlipoca, into drinking pulque, into breaking his vows. Shamed, he had left, had sailed east on a raft of serpents, promising to return This story, the return of Quetzalcoatl, would become one of the most consequential myths in history, when a group of strange men arrived from the east in the Aztec year 1 read, which corresponded to 1519 AD, the year associated with Quetzalcoatl's return. The question arose, had the god come back? Was this the fulfillment of the ancient promise? The question paralyzed the Aztec response at the most critical moment, not because the Aztecs were naive, but because the question was genuinely impossible to answer with the information they had. Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, god of the night sky, of sorcery, of conflict and change. His symbol was an obsidian mirror, the black volcanic glass that the Aztecs used for divination, in which a skilled seer could see the future, or so it was believed. Tezcatlipoca was Quetzalcoatl's eternal enemy and eternal counterpart, where Quetzalcoatl represented order, civilization, learning. Tezcatlipoca represented chaos, darkness, the unpredictable forces that no civilization can fully control. The Aztecs did not try to eliminate Tezcatlipoca from their cosmology. They incorporated him, honored him, made offerings to him, because chaos is real, the night is real, the forces that undermine order are real. Better to acknowledge them, better to have rituals for placating them, than to pretend they don't exist and be caught unprepared when they arrive. This was the Aztec wisdom, not naive, not simple, deeply aware of the darkness in the world, and trying, always trying, to manage it, to keep it in its proper place. The night, the mirror, the places where order thins, rather than letting it swallow everything. The smoking mirror shows you what is there, not what you want to see. The Aztecs looked, even when looking was difficult, especially then. The 5 suns. The Aztec creation story was not a single creation, it was 5. The gods had created the world 4 times before, and destroyed it 4 times. Each destruction, by jaguar, by wind, by rain of fire, by flood, was the end of one age and the beginning of the next. We live in the 5th sun, the 5th age, the age of movement, Nahui Alan, which was destined to end in earthquakes. Not if, when. The Aztecs knew their world was temporary, knew it would end, could not know when, but knew it was coming. This knowledge, rather than producing despair, produced urgency. If the world was going to end, it had to be sustained as long as possible, fed as long as possible. The gods had sacrificed themselves to create this 5th sun, had thrown themselves into a sacred fire at Teotihuacan, so that the sun could rise. The debt was immense. The only way to repay it, the only way to keep the 5th sun rising each morning, was to give back what the gods had given: life, blood, the most precious substance in the most temporary world that had ever existed and would not exist forever. The Templo Mayor was rebuilt 7 times. Each new Aztec ruler, upon taking the throne, added a new layer, a new casing around the existing pyramid, larger than the last. enclosing the previous temple. Inside it, like nested boxes, each layer representing a different reign, a different ruler's contribution to the sacred center of the world. The pyramid that the Spanish saw in 1519 was the seventh iteration, the seventh layer. Inside it, 6 earlier pyramids, each one complete, each one still standing, preserved by the very act of being enclosed by the next. When archaeologists excavated the Templo Mayor, after its rediscovery in 1978, they found offerings from every layer, thousands of ritual objects, jade figurines, coral and shell from both coasts, Pacific and Atlantic, obsidian blades, animal remains, crocodiles, jaguars, eagles, sharks, human remains, ceramic vessels, precious stones, each offering placed at a cosmologically significant location, according to a logic that archaeologists are still working to fully understand. The pyramid was not just a temple, it was an archive, a physical record, layer by layer, of every significant moment in Aztec imperial history, buried, preserved, waiting to be read by people who came after, who had no idea it was there. The new fire ceremony. Every 52 years, the 2 Aztec calendars came back into alignment, the same day in both. The sacred 260-day calendar and the solar 365-day calendar, occurring simultaneously. This happened every 52 years, the end of one great calendar cycle, the beginning of another, and the Aztecs were not certain that the next cycle would begin, that the sun would rise, that the fifth age would continue on the last night. All fires in the empire were extinguished. Every hearth, every torch, every sacred flame, the entire empire went dark. People gathered on rooftops, waited in silence. Priests climbed the hill of the star outside Tenochtitlan and watched the Pleiades star cluster reach the zenith. If they passed overhead without stopping, the world would continue. When the Pleiades reached the zenith, a priest drilled fire on the chest of a sacrificial victim. If the fire caught, the world would survive. It caught. It always caught. A runner carried the new fire from the hill of the star to the Templo Mayor, where it lit the sacred flame that lit the torches carried to every neighborhood in the city, that lit every hearth in the empire, from one fire to 1,000,000 fires in a single night. The world had survived for 52 more years. The scale of sacrifice, the great dedication of the Templo Mayor in 1487 under the ruler Ahuitzotl is the most cited example of Aztec human sacrifice. The ancient sources, both Aztec and Spanish, claim that 20,000 people were sacrificed over 4 days. Some sources say 80,000. Modern scholars debate these numbers. 20,000 in 4 days would require a rate of approximately 1 sacrifice every 17 seconds around the clock for 4 days. Most historians believe the numbers are exaggerated, perhaps significantly, but even if the actual number was a fraction of what was claimed, it was still large. still significant, still disturbing. The Spanish who witnessed Aztec sacrifice were horrified. They used the horror to justify what they did next, which was also disturbing, which was also large, which was also significant. History rarely offers simple moral positions. The Aztecs sacrificed. The Spanish conquered, enslaved, and killed in numbers that dwarfed any Aztec sacrifice. Both things are true. Both things matter. The question of which was worse is perhaps less important than understanding why both happened, what humans are capable of. When they believe the stakes are high enough, when they believe the cosmos demands it, or when they simply want what the other person has. Walking the Templo Mayor today, in the heart of Mexico City, 1 block from the great cathedral, which was built using stones from the demolished Templo Mayor, stand the excavated remains of the Great Pyramid. You can walk around it, stand at the base of the staircases that once led to the temples of Tlaloc and Huitzilopochtli. The steps are worn, not by the millions of feet that climbed them, but by the centuries of burial under the Spanish city and the decades of careful excavation. The museum beside the site, one of the finest archaeological museums in the world, contains the objects found inside. The stone disc of Coyolxauhqui, 8.5 tons, that started everything, stands in its own room, 8 feet across, carved with the dismembered body of the moon goddess, a masterpiece of ancient American art, found under a street by accident 40 years ago, and the excavations continue every year. New discoveries beneath Mexico City, each one adding to our understanding of what stood here before the Spanish came, before everything changed, before the fifth sun entered its next phase. The Templo Mayor is quiet tonight. The excavation lights are off. The museum is closed. The great disk of Coyolxauhqui, the dismembered moon, lies in the dark, as she has always lain, in darkness, in the underworld, in the ground, in the locked museum, waiting for the sun, her brother, to rise again. Above Mexico City, the largest metropolis in the Western Hemisphere, 20 million people, sleeping where Tenochtitlan once stood, on the same lake bed, now drained, in the same valley, surrounded by the same mountains, under the same sky, that Aztec priests watched every night, for signs, for the movement of Venus, for the position of the Pleiades, for any indication that the fifth sun would survive another day. It survived, past the Spanish conquest, past the destruction of the temples, past the burning of the books, past everything. The sun still rises over the Valley of Mexico, as it rose over Tenochtitlan, as it will rise long after Mexico City has become whatever it is going to become. The fifth sun endures, still fed by something, still rising every morning, without fail. In February of 1519, 11 ships left Cuba, 508 soldiers, 16 horses, 14 cannons, under the command of a 33-year-old Spanish nobleman, Hernán Cortez. He had no official authorization for this expedition. The governor of Cuba Diego Velázquez, had revoked his commission. At the last moment, Cortez sailed anyway. This tells you everything you need to know about Hernán Cortez. He was not a man who let authority get in the way of ambition. He had been in the Caribbean for 15 years, long enough to grow impatient with small rewards, long enough to hear the rumors of a great empire to the west. Gold, cities, civilization, the things that brought Europeans to the Americas and destroyed everything they found there. 508 men against an empire of millions. The mathematics seemed absurd. It was absurd. And yet, within 2 years, Tenochtitlan would fall. The greatest city in the Americas would be rubble. And the Aztec Empire, 5 centuries in the making, would be gone. How this happened is one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of the human world. The beach landing Cortez landed on the Gulf Coast of Mexico, in the region of the Totonac people, who were subjects of the Aztec Empire and who hated it. This was the first thing Cortez learned, and the most important thing he would ever learn about the situation he was entering. The Aztec Empire was not loved. It was feared. The tribute system, which demanded enormous quantities of goods from conquered peoples. The flower wars, which demanded their young men as sacrificial victims. The Aztec habit of leaving local rulers in place, but extracting everything of value from their territories, had created an empire built on resentment. Every city that had been conquered and humiliated, every people forced to send their sons to die on Aztec altars, was a potential ally for anyone who offered liberation. Cortez understood this immediately, not because he was uniquely perceptive, but because the Totonacs told him directly. They wanted help. They wanted the Aztec yoke removed. And here was this strange man from the east, with his horses that no one had seen before, his guns that spoke like thunder, his skin the color of the god who had promised to return, offering exactly that. Cortez had arrived at precisely the right moment, in an empire that was ready to fall, if someone would just push it. La Malinche. Before Cortez could do anything, he needed to communicate, and for that, he needed her. Her name was Malintzin, later baptized Morena, called La Malinche by history, a name that has become, in Mexican culture, almost synonymous with betrayal. She was a young woman, perhaps 17 or 18, from the Gulf Coast region, who had been sold into slavery as a child by her own family, and had ended up in the Yucatan, where she had learned both Maya and Nahuatl, the Aztec language. When Cortez received her as part of a gift of slaves from the Totonacs, he discovered she could speak to his translator, who spoke Maya, who could then speak to Cortez, who spoke Spanish. A chain of translation, imperfect, but functional. Cortez made her his interpreter, his advisor, eventually his companion, the mother of his son. Without La Malinche, Cortez could not have communicated with the peoples he encountered, could not have formed the alliances he formed, could not have understood the political situation he was navigating. The conquest of Mexico was built on her words. History has been unkind to her, calling her a traitor to her people. But which were her people? The people who had sold her into slavery? Or the people she chose to serve? The question has no clean answer. As most important questions do not. Moctezuma's dilemma. The Aztec emperor, Moctezuma II, heard about the strangers the moment they landed. His intelligence network was excellent. Artists were sent to the coast to observe and draw what they saw. Their reports came back. Detailed pictures of the Spanish ships, the horses, the armor, the weapons, things that had no Aztec equivalent, no Aztec word. Moctezuma was not stupid. He was one of the most sophisticated rulers in the world. He had governed an empire of millions for 14 years. He had expanded it, had managed its complex political relationships with skill. But he faced a problem that no amount of intelligence or experience could fully resolve. What were these people? Men, clearly, but men with powers that seemed almost divine. The guns, the horses, which the Aztecs initially perceived as a single creature, man and animal together, the metal armor that blades could not penetrate, and the timing, the year one read, the year of Quetzalcoatl's promised return. Moctezuma sent gifts, magnificent gifts, including the ritual regalia of Quetzalcoatl himself, to find out how the strangers would respond. If they were gods, the gifts would please them. If they were men, the gifts would satisfy them. They would take what was offered and leave. Cortez took the gifts and kept coming. The march to Tenochtitlan. Cortez left the coast. In August of 1519, he burned his ships. The famous act that left his men with no way back, no retreat, no option but forward. Either they succeeded or they died. The march took months, through jungle and mountains, through the territories of peoples who were potential allies or potential enemies. Tlaxcala almost destroyed him. The Tlaxcalans, the Aztecs' great rivals, the people they had fought flower wars against for generations, were not immediately welcoming to the Spanish. They fought them several times, hard. The Spanish guns and horses, so devastating against peoples who had never seen them, were less effective against Tlaxcalan warriors who adapted quickly, who learned to aim at the horses, to attack at night. When the guns were harder to use, the battles were close. Cortez nearly lost. And then, the Tlaxcalans made a calculation. The enemy of my enemy. The Spanish wanted to destroy the Aztecs. The Tlaxcalans wanted to destroy the Aztecs. The alliance was made, and suddenly Cortez had not 500 men, but thousands. The conquest of Mexico was not Spanish against Aztec. It was anti-Aztec coalition, with Spanish leadership against Aztec Empire. This distinction matters more than most histories have acknowledged. Entering Tenochtitlan. November 8, 1519. Cortez and his army, Spanish soldiers and thousands of Tlaxcalan allies, walked along the southern causeway into Tenochtitlan. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, the soldier who later wrote the most vivid account of the conquest, described his first sight of the city, the great towers and temples rising from the water, the buildings gleaming white, the causeways crowded with people coming and going, the canoes on the lake, the markets, the gardens, the scale of it, unlike anything any of them had seen. We were amazed, he wrote, and said that it was like the enchantments they tell of in the legend of Amatis, on account of the great towers and buildings rising from the water, like something from a fairy tale, like something that should not exist, but did. Moctezuma came out to meet them, carried on a litter, shaded by a canopy of green feathers and gold, his feet not touching the ground, because the ground was not worthy of him. He greeted Cortez with courtesy, with formality, with the elaborate ritual that the occasion demanded. The most powerful man in the Americas meeting the man who would destroy him, either of them knowing yet exactly how this would end. The imprisonment. Cortez made a decision that was either brilliant or reckless, depending on how you look at it. He took Moctezuma prisoner, not openly, not with force, not at first, through a combination of persuasion, implied threat, and the particular political genius of a man who understood that in certain situations, speed and audacity substitute for numbers. Moctezuma, for reasons that have been debated for 5 centuries, allowed it. He moved to the Spanish quarters, remained there, continued to govern, receiving ambassadors, issuing orders, maintaining the rituals of his office, but increasingly under Spanish supervision, under Spanish control. The empire, for a period of months, was governed by its emperor, who was governed by a man with 500 soldiers. The Aztec nobles watched this with growing horror and confusion. Their emperor, the representative of the gods on earth, was a prisoner, was issuing orders that seemed to serve the stranger's interests. Something was profoundly wrong, and the people of Tenochtitlan could feel it, even if they couldn't yet see where it was going. The massacre at the festival, while Cortez was away from Tenochtitlan, dealing with a rival Spanish expedition sent to arrest him. His lieutenant Pedro de Alvarado made a decision that destroyed everything. The Aztecs were celebrating the festival of Toxcatl, a major religious ceremony in honor of Huitzilopochtli. The greatest warriors of Tenochtitlan had gathered in the sacred precinct, unarmed, for the dance, for the ceremony. Alvarado attacked them. The reasons given: that he feared an uprising, that the ceremony was a preparation for attack, are not believed by most historians. The more likely explanation was greed. The gold and jade the warriors wore for the ceremony, whatever the reason, the result was catastrophic. The greatest warriors of the Aztec Empire slaughtered in the sacred precinct, unarmed, during a religious ceremony. Tenochtitlan rose in fury. The Spanish were besieged in their quarters, cut off from food and water. Moctezuma, brought out to calm his people, was killed. How, disputed. By the Spanish, who said his own people stoned him. By the Aztecs, who said the Spanish killed him. Either way, he was gone, and Cortez returned to a city on the edge of consuming him. La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, June 30th, 1520. Cortez tried to escape Tenochtitlan at night, quietly, under cover of darkness, loading the gold. They had accumulated enormous quantities of gold onto horses and men. Too much gold. The Aztecs discovered them on the causeway. What followed was slaughter. The Spanish and their allies, trying to cross the causeway, were attacked from canoes from both sides. The causeway had gaps where the removable bridges had been. Men and horses fell into the dark water, weighed down by gold, drowned. Of the roughly 1,300 Spanish soldiers, perhaps 800 died that night. Thousands of Tlaxcalan allies. The horses, the cannons, most of the gold, gone. Cortez, the stories say, sat under a tree at the edge of the lake and wept. El Arbol de la Noche Triste, the tree of the night of sorrows, was pointed out to visitors in Mexico City for centuries afterward. Whether he actually wept, or whether the story was added later, doesn't matter. Something was lost that night. That cannot be quantified. Not gold. People. Thousands of people. Spanish and Tlaxcalan and Aztec. All of them dead. In the dark water. For what? For gold. For empire. For the collision of two worlds that neither had chosen, but both had to navigate. The siege. Cortez did not give up. He retreated to Tlaxcala, regrouped, built new alliances, built brigantines, small warships, to control the lake. And in May of 1521, he returned with 100,000 allies. The siege of Tenochtitlan lasted 75 days. The Aztecs fought ferociously, brilliantly, desperately. Their new emperor, Cuauhtémoc, the last Tlatoani, organized the defense with skill and courage. He was 25 years old. He knew what was at stake. The Spanish controlled the lake. The brigantines cut off the food supply. The causeways were contested, block by block. The city was taken, the Spanish destroyed. As they advanced, what they could not control, they demolished. The temples, the palaces, the markets, reduced to rubble, used as fill. To make the advance easier, the population starved, died of smallpox, the disease the Spanish had brought unknowingly, that the Aztecs had no immunity to, that killed more people than all the fighting combined. On August 13, 1521, Cuauhtémoc attempted to escape by canoe, was captured, brought before Cortez, the last emperor of the Aztecs, a young man, in chains. Tenochtitlan had fallen. The city was silent. What had been, 2 years before, the greatest city in the Americas, the city of canals and floating gardens, the city of markets, visited by 60,000 people, the city of pyramids and feathered gods, and the careful, cosmic machinery that had kept the fifth sun rising, was rubble, smoke, the smell of death. Over the lake, Bernal Diaz, who had walked through the market at Tlatelolco, with his mouth open, walked through the ruins now, and wrote that there was no stone or wall that was not stained with blood, no place to step that was not a body. He had seen the most beautiful city in the world, and he had helped destroy it. The contradiction lived in him for the rest of his life. He wrote his account as an old man to correct what he saw as inaccuracies in other histories, to make sure the record was right, to make sure someone remembered what had been there, what had been lost. The lake is drained now. Mexico City stands where Tenochtitlan stood. The pyramids are gone, or buried. The canals are streets. The floating gardens exist only in a few remaining chinampas in the borough of Xochimilco. But the people remained. The Nahua people, the descendants of the Aztecs, are still there, still speaking variants of Nahuatl, still carrying in their language, in their food, in their traditions, something of what was here before, something the conquest could destroy the buildings of, but could not entirely erase. The city fell. The people did not. Cuauhtémoc was tortured. The Spanish wanted to know where the gold was. The gold of Tenochtitlan, the legendary treasure of the Aztec Empire. Most of it had been lost in the lake on the night of sorrows. Cortez believed more was hidden. Cuauhtémoc, the last emperor, 25 years old, his city in ruins, his people dying, was held over a fire, his feet burned. He did not tell them where the gold was, because there was no more gold to find, or because he would not tell them. The historical record is unclear. What is clear is that a man who had fought with everything he had, who had defended his city to the last stone, who had been captured, trying to save what remained of his people, was tortured for treasure, and said nothing, or had nothing to say. Cortez kept him alive as a political tool, a symbol of legitimate Aztec authority that could be used to smooth the transition to Spanish rule. 3 years later, on a march to Honduras, Cortez had him hanged on suspicion of conspiracy. The last emperor of the Aztecs died on a tree in the jungle, far from Tenochtitlan, far from the pyramids his ancestors had built, far from the lake where the eagle had sat on the cactus and promised everything. The smallpox, before the Spanish had even reached Tenochtitlan, the disease had arrived. A single infected soldier in the first Spanish expedition that touched the Mexican coast had introduced the pathogen to a continent that had never seen it, that had no immunity to it. Smallpox moved faster than Cortez moved ahead of him, from village to village, from trading contact to trading contact, killing as it went. The epidemic hit Tenochtitlan in 1520. During the siege, the population was already weakened by the blockade, already starving. The smallpox found them at their most vulnerable. Historians estimate that between 50 and 90% of the indigenous population of central Mexico died in the epidemics of the 16th century. Not just smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, mumps, disease after disease, arriving in waves against a population with no immune defenses. For over a century, the conquest was not won by Spanish swords. It was won by germs. The swords could have been defeated. The Aztecs were fighting back, were adapting, were close to driving the Spanish into the sea. On the night of sorrows, the disease could not be fought, could not be seen, could not be understood, could only be suffered. And the suffering was on a scale that no human war has ever matched. 50 million people, perhaps more, dead in a century, from contact with the old world. The greatest demographic catastrophe in human history. The burning of the books. Diego de Landa, the Franciscan friar, who burned the Maya codices, was not alone in his destruction. Across Mexico, Spanish priests and administrators systematically destroyed the written records of the civilizations they conquered. The Aztec books, the codices recording history, astronomy, ritual, tribute, were collected and burned because they were instruments of the devil, because they recorded the worship of false gods, because they preserved a way of understanding the world that challenged the Spanish Catholic worldview. A few survived, rescued by priests who understood belatedly that they were destroying irreplaceable knowledge. The Florentine Codex, compiled by the Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagun, who spent decades interviewing Aztec elders, recording their history, their customs, their worldview, before they died, and took their knowledge with them. Sahagun understood, perhaps better than most of his contemporaries, that what was being lost was irreplaceable, that the destruction was not just of objects, but of ways of seeing, ways of understanding the cosmos, ways of being human, that would never exist again once the last person who remembered them was gone. He tried to record what he could. It was not enough. It never is. When a civilization dies, most of what it knew dies with it. The books that survived are windows into a world we can glimpse, but never fully see. New Spain. The Spanish built their colony on the ruins. Literally, Mexico's city rose on the rubble of Tenochtitlan. The stones of the Templo Mayor built the cathedral that still stands beside the excavated ruins of the pyramid. The same stones, different purpose, different God. The Spanish imposed their language, their religion, their laws, their social hierarchy, the encomienda system, which gave Spanish settlers the right to the labor of indigenous people in specific territories, was, in practice, not far from slavery. The indigenous people, who survived the epidemics, were converted to Christianity, forced to work, forced to pay tribute, now to Spanish lords, instead of Aztec ones. The tribute system had not ended. It had changed ownership. But the church was not entirely the instrument of destruction. Some priests, Bartolomé de las Casas, most famously, argued passionately, publicly, repeatedly, that the indigenous people were full human beings, that their enslavement was a crime against God, that what Spain was doing in the Americas was wrong. He wrote about it, testified about it, argued about it. Before the Spanish court. Once some reforms. Not enough. Not nearly enough. But the argument was made. The record existed. Someone had said, "This is wrong," and refused to stop saying it. Until someone listened. A little. The syncretism. Something unexpected happened. In the century after the conquest, the two worlds, Spanish Catholic and indigenous Mesoamerican, did not simply replace one another. They merged. Imperfectly, painfully, but genuinely. The Virgin of Guadalupe, the apparition of the Virgin Mary to an indigenous man named Juan Diego in 1531, on a hill that had previously been sacred to the Aztec goddess Tenochtitlan, became the most important religious symbol in Mexico. Still is. She was dark-skinned. She spoke Nahuatl. She appeared to an indigenous man, not to the Spanish. The Catholic Church was uncomfortable with the Guadalupe apparition, for exactly the reasons that made it resonate so deeply with the indigenous population. She was theirs, a mother goddess figure, recognizable from the pre-conquest tradition, wrapped in Catholic imagery, made accessible to people who had lost everything and needed something to hold on to. The mixing was everywhere. Indigenous plants and Spanish animals in the same fields. Nahuatl words in the Spanish language. Spanish words in Nahuatl. Catholic saints identified with indigenous deities. Catholic feast days celebrated with indigenous dances and foods. A new culture, neither entirely Spanish nor entirely indigenous, being born in the spaces between Mexico, something that had never existed before, something that could only have come from this particular collision of these particular worlds, in this particular place. The Maya resistance. The Maya were not conquered as quickly or as completely as the Aztecs. The Maya highlands fell relatively quickly, but the lowland Maya, the descendants of the classic period cities, resisted for over 150 years. The Itzá Maya, centered on the island city of Tayasal in the Petén Lakes of Guatemala, were not conquered until 1697, 178 years after the fall of Tenochtitlan, the last independent Maya kingdom, still functioning, still maintaining the old traditions, still performing the old rituals, in the deep jungle, far from Spanish power. When the Spanish finally reached Tayasal, they found a city that had preserved the classic Maya tradition for over 1,000 years. After the Great Collapse, priests who still knew the calendar, still performed the ceremonies, still maintained the connection between the human world and the Divine One. The Itzá Maya had held on in the jungle while everything around them changed until they couldn't hold on anymore. The conquest was complete, but it had taken almost 2 centuries, which is a reminder that people do not give up their world easily, that the end of a civilization is never as quick as the conquerors would like to believe. What the Spanish found and did not understand was that they had conquered something they could not replace. The agricultural knowledge of the Maya and Aztecs, accumulated over 3,000 years, was extraordinary. the Chinampas, the terraced hillside agriculture, the sophisticated water management, the breeding of maize into hundreds of varieties, adapted to different climates, different altitudes, different growing conditions. Much of this knowledge was lost with the people who held it. The population collapse. 50 to 90% dead. Took with it the farmers who knew which variety of maize grew best in which soil, the healers who knew which plants cured which illness, the engineers who understood the Chinampas, the land that had fed millions, became, in many places, less productive, because the people who knew how to farm it properly were dead. What the Spanish left behind was not just a conquered civilization. It was a wound in the landscape itself, a reduction in the world's accumulated knowledge that could never fully be recovered. The plants that came to Europe from the Americas, maize, potatoes, tomatoes, chocolate, chili peppers, vanilla, avocado, changed the world, fed billions of people who would otherwise have starved. The food revolution of the 16th century was a gift from the civilizations the Spanish destroyed. The irony is almost too large to hold in the mind. The descendants, the Maya and Aztec civilizations, are not gone. Their descendants are alive. Millions of them. In Mexico, over 1 million people still speak Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs. Over 6 million people speak one of the 30 Mayan languages. Still living in the same lands their ancestors lived in, still farming many of the same crops, still performing ceremonies, adapted, syncretized, changed by 5 centuries of contact with Christianity and modernity, but still connected to what came before. The Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos, the Mexican celebration in which families gather at the graves of their ancestors, building altars, bringing food, welcoming the dead back for one night, is a fusion of Catholic All Saints' Day and the ancient Aztec festivals for the dead. The ancient belief that the dead are not entirely gone, that the boundary between the living and the dead is permeable, that the dead can be fed, can be honored, can be kept present through memory, through ritual, through the act of remembering, is not Catholic. It is Aztec. It is Maya. It is 3,000 years old, still practiced every year by millions of people who know, even if they can't articulate it, that this is older than the church, older than the conquest, older than everything that tried to replace it and failed. The Zapatista Uprising, January 1st, 1994. The day the North American Free Trade Agreement came into force. A group of indigenous Maya people from the state of Chiapas took up arms, called themselves the Izyalan, the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, named for Emiliano Zapata, the revolutionary leader of the Mexican Revolution, who had fought for land rights for indigenous people and been betrayed. The Zapatistas were not trying to restore the Maya Empire. They were not romanticizing the past. They were farmers, Maya farmers, who were about to lose their communal lands under the new trade agreement, who had been losing their lands for 500 years, who said, "Enough." The uprising was suppressed militarily, but not eliminated. The Zapatistas still exist, still control territory in Chiapas, still building their autonomous communities. Their most famous communique, written by their leader, Subcommandant Marcos, ended with words that echoed through the global left for a generation. Ya basta. Enough. 500 years of enough. The Maya are not a historical footnote. They are a people with a present and a future that they are still fighting for. What remained after the conquest, after the epidemics, after the burning of the books, after 5 centuries of colonial rule and post-colonial struggle? What remained? The pyramids, still standing, still pointing at the stars, still aligned to the equinoxes, still calculating the calendar, in stone and shadow, the languages, Nahuatl, Maya, Zapotec, Mixtec, Otomi, Totonac, still spoken, still changing, still alive. The food, maize, chocolate, tomatoes, chili, vanilla, avocado, on tables across the world every day. The knowledge, agricultural techniques, medical plants, ecological understanding of the tropical landscape, preserved in the practices of indigenous communities, and increasingly studied by scientists who understand that traditional knowledge can contain things that Western science has yet to discover: the cosmology, the understanding of time as cyclical, the sense of human beings as participants in, not masters of, the natural world, the obligation to the dead, the obligation to the future, the idea that the world requires maintenance, that existence is not free, that the debt to what came before us is real and must be paid in whatever currency is available, in whatever way is possible, in the daily work of being alive and trying to leave the world slightly better than you found it. The 5th sun still rises over the Valley of Mexico, over the jungle of the Yucatan, over the highlands of Guatemala, where the Maya still live, still speaking their languages, still watching the stars. The Templo Mayor lies in its excavation, open to the sky, a few blocks from the cathedral that was built from its stones, both standing, both present, both part of the same city. That is neither entirely Spanish nor entirely Aztec, but something that only this place, this history, this collision of worlds could have produced. Mexico, the mile-long count, continues. The calendar does not stop, because the cities that maintained it are gone. Time continues. The cycles turn. Somewhere tonight, in a village in Chiapas, in a city in the Yucatan, in a community in Oaxaca, someone is watching the sky, the same sky the priests of Tikal watched, the same sky the astronomers of Chichen Itza mapped with such precision, the same sky that held the answers to the questions that the Maya and Aztecs spent 3,000 years asking. What are we? Where did we come from? What do we owe? To the gods? To the dead? To each other? To the world that sustains us? The questions have not been answered. They never are. That is why we keep asking them. That is why the pyramids were built. That is why the stories were told. That is why tonight we are still here, still asking, in the dark, where all the important questions live.
you.